Decimal notation. Decimal place values on the chart. At the decimal point, the numbers to the left are whole numbers. The first place being 1, second 10, third hundredths, fourth 1,000, and so on. At the decimal point, the numbers to the right are the decimal places. So the first decimal place is known as the tenths. The second is known as the hundredths. The third, thousandths, and the fourth, 10,000ths. So when we're talking about decimal place values, you want to think in terms of one decimal place and would be the 10th place, two decimal place would be a hundredths place, and so on. So the rounding rule for decimals, you always want to look to the number to the right of the rounding number. So it's based on what the rounding number is. And then you're going to look to the number directly to the right. If the number is any number from 0 to 4, you do not change the rounding number. You just drop all the other numbers. If the number to the right of the rounding number is 5 or above, then you're rounding the number up by one number. And then you drop all the other numbers to the right side of the rounding number. So in this example, we want to round to the nearest tenth. And the nearest tenth means that we're one decimal place. So you want to look at the 10th spot, look to the number to the right, and in this case we have a 4, which means I'm just going to chop everything off and do nothing to the number that we're rounding. This next example says round to the nearest hundredth. So I want to go to the hundredths place, look at the number next to the hundredths place. It's an 8, which means I need to round the hundredths place up by 1. So this turns to be 1.28. This next one is asking us to round to the nearest thousandths. That means I'm going to the thousandths place. I'm going to look to the number to the right, and in this case it's a 5, which means I need to round up 1. Pause and try. Nearest hundredths, so you end up with 0.74. Pause and try. Nearest tenth, you have to round up because to the right is a 7. Pause and try. Nearest thousandths means you got to go to the thousandth spot, and you see a 4 to the right, so it just gets chopped off. So when we're doing addition and subtraction of decimals, you need to line each piece up by its decimal place. And if there's missing spots, you add zeros. So in this case, I'm going to start with the 4.31, and then I'm going to line each one up after it. So I'm going to have the 0.146 underneath it, and then I have 14.2. So I lined everything up based on the decimal, and I'm going to add zeros in the spots where I need them. So now I can add down. So when you're doing addition, you have 0 plus 6 plus 6. You're going to work from the right to the left. So 0 plus 6 plus 0 is going to be 6. And then I have 1 plus 4 plus 0 is 5. And then I have 3 plus 1 is 4, plus 2 is going to be 6. And then make sure you bring down that decimal place. And then you have the 4 plus 4 plus 0 is 8. And then the 1 comes down. So when you do addition of decimals, it's very important that you line up the decimal place before you start doing the addition. So this next one, notice that the first number here does not have a decimal place, and the second number does. So when you're doing the line up here, you're going to start with the first number, and then you're going to put the decimal place on the end of the first number. And because it has no decimals, you're going to put zeros in the spots for every decimal place of the other number. And now you can do the addition. So when you're adding a whole number with a number that has decimals, you're going to have to add those decimal places by putting zeros. And then you're going to do your addition. Make sure you bring the decimal down. And then in this case, you have 6 plus 7 is 13. And because you're only putting the one spot down, you have to carry the 1 of that 13 to the next position and add it. So you end up having 1 plus 7 plus 1 is going to be 9, and then the 5 and the 4 come down. So this is how you add a whole number with a decimal. Now with subtraction, you have to line up the decimal places, but you're going to be subtracting. And if you have to, you're going to have to borrow if necessary. So in this case, I have 34.07, and we're subtracting 4.0052. Now, because I do not have all the decimal places in the first number, I have to add those zeros. Now, with subtraction, you have to make sure that you can subtract from the number. And because I can't subtract 2 from 0, I'm going to have to borrow. So I can't borrow anything from the 0, so I'm going to have to go all the way over to the 7. And I'm going to take away 1 from the 7, and I'm going to get 6. And I'm going to bring it to the next number. And because I'm borrowing, I'm going to end up having that 0 be a 10. And then I need to borrow from that 10 to get that 0 on the end to be a number I can subtract 2 from. So I'm going to borrow from 10, and I'm going to take away 1, which is going to be 9, and then I'm going to add that 10 to the 0. So I end up having 10 on the end. So now I have 10 minus 2 is going to give me 8. And you see here I have 9 minus 5, so I'm going to end up with 4, and then 6 minus 0 is going to be 6. 0 minus 0. Bring down that decimal place, and now I have 4 minus 4 is 0, and 3 just comes down. So I just subtracted the 34.07 by the 4.0052. And this is my answer. So this next one is subtraction with a whole number and a number with a decimal. So you always have to line it up. And remember, a whole number, you can place a decimal on the end. And I'm going to line up the decimal place. And because there's no decimals, I'm going to add those zeros. And then I'm going to have to borrow. So in this case, I have to go all the way over to the 4 to borrow. So I end up having the 10 minus 5 is 5. 9 minus 2 is 7. 9 minus 8 is 1. I'm bringing down that decimal. And then 3 minus 3 is 0. And the 7 and the 5. Pause and try. So make sure you're lining up the decimals and adding in those spots with the zeros. And then when you do the addition here, you should have gotten 34.198. Pause and try. Very important to line up the decimals, add that place marker of 0, and do your subtraction. So in this case, you had to borrow, and you ended up with borrowing all the way across, and your final answer should have been 347.606. Pause and try. So you have to add those zeros, and you're going to have to borrow from the 4. So you end up with your final answer is 138.28. So now let's try a word problem. Pause and try. Because she's purchasing, we're going to end up subtracting. So I'm going to subtract the first number from the total dollar amount. So I'm going to be left with $4.25. Then I'm going to subtract the second number, which is the iced tea. So I'm going to end up with $2.55. So with multiplication, multiplication works differently than addition and subtraction. You do not need to line up the decimal places. So ignore the decimal place until the end. We're going to write it in columns, and then we're going to do the multiplication. You're going to multiply the first number by the second number. You're going to multiply right to left. So you're taking that 3 and multiplying it to everything from right to left. 3 times 2 is 6. 3 times 3 is 9. 3 times 7 is 21. And then you're going to take the second number and multiply it through. But remember, when you multiply, you have to put a 0 in the first spot and then multiply across. So you have 5 times 2 is 10. So you end up with a 0 and carrying the 1. 5 times 3 is 15, and then you need to add the 1, so you get 16, and you need to carry the 1. 5 times 7 is 35, and then you need to add the 1, so you get 36. And now what you do is you add down. 6 plus 0 is 6. 9 plus 0 is 9. 1 plus 6 is 7. 2 plus 6 is 8, and then 3. Now you need to count the decimal places to put it into the answer. You're counting the decimal places of the decimals that you just multiplied. So you notice here that the 7.32 is 2 decimals and the 5.3 is 1 decimal. So you end up having 3 decimal places. So you have to take 3 decimal places, count it from the right to the left, and you're going to put a decimal place 3 decimal places over. So this would be your answer. Pause and try. So in this case, you line it up. We end up having 1 times 1 is 1, 1 times 2 is 2, and then you put the 0 in the next spot for the ones, and then you do 3 times 1 is 3, 3 times 2 is 6, add down, and then you have 2 decimal places, so you're going to add that decimal place 2 decimal places over. Pause and try. So in this case, you have to be careful because we're dealing with decimals and we're also dealing with the negative sign. So I'm going to do the multiplication here. I see it's 2 decimal places, and then I end up with a negative 0.30. Or you could just have a negative 0.3. The 0 doesn't really matter in this case. So when we're changing a percent to a decimal, the way it works is you add a decimal place to the end, and then you count or move 2 places to the left. So in this case, when I convert 43% to a decimal, I end up getting a 0.43 as my answer. So changing a percent to a decimal, you add a decimal point on the end, move it 2 places to the left, and you drop the percent sign. Pause and try. So you should have gotten 0.27. Pause and try. So in this case, you should have gotten 1.69. Pause and try. Now this one you have to be careful because when you go over 2 spots, you're missing a number, so you have to put a 0 in that spot. So you end up with 0.06. So let's do some percent word problems. It's asking us here, what is 22% of 60? So a key note here is the word of means we're going to be multiplying. So this is what we have. We have 22% times 60. Well, you can't multiply with the percent symbol. So you're going to have to convert that percent to a decimal. So the first thing you're going to have to do is make that percent a decimal. And to do that, we get rid of the percent symbol and we move the decimal place over 2 spots. So we end up with 0.22. Then we're going to multiply the decimal 0.22 to 60. So when you do the multiplication here, you should get 13.2 is 22% of 60. Pause and try. So when you do the multiplication here, you should be using 0.15. You multiply, you should have gotten 22.5 as your answer. Next example, we have a school has a total enrollment of 800 students. 20% of the students play sports. How many students play sports? So the information here, in other words, it's asking us, what is 20% of 80? So when you're reading a word problem, you always want to determine what information do I need from it to be able to answer what they're looking for. So they're looking to know what 20% of 800 is. So you do the multiplication by converting the percent to a decimal and then multiply. So we end up having 0.20 times 800. So in this case, we're going to end up with 160 students play sports. Pause and try. So we're going to take what is 30% of 200. We're going to multiply, and you should have gotten here 60 students enrolled in Spanish. Pause and try. So this is a little tricky. It wants to know what is 25% of 2,174. So you're doing the multiplication of 0.25 to the 2,174, and you should have gotten 543.5 miles.